At around midnight just a year ago, emergency workers faced what's being called the worst chemical fire this country has ever seen.
Can you check if the houses on Irwin Street have been evacuated, please? Over.
I don't think there's any occupied, but I will follow that up.
And I was in the shower and we heard this almighty explosion.
I got woken up because I thought the kids playing with fireworks or something. It was firework, all right, but 44-gallon drums flying in the air.
A toxic cocktail poured into the night sky. Firefighters battled to control it. Unknown chemicals combined to mutate. Lethal dioxins were formed and explosions sent the deadly material in all directions.
You're getting huge plumes of black, dirty, contaminated, very toxic smoke.
This was the devastating end of one of Australia's many chemical dumps.
Roofing structures collapsed.
Tonight on Four Corners, a worrying case study of a dangerous waste facility in a city suburb.
Thick, oily residue on top of the water here.
A story of corporate and government recklessness and attempts to keep it secret.
These drums are being dumped in the ocean because they're considered too dangerous to dispose of on land.
30 years ago, a Four Corners camera crew filmed the company ICI dumping toxic waste directly into the ocean off the coast of Sydney. The program caused a public outcry.
Some of the drums were badly rusted. Some leaked. While at least 3 of them failed to sink and may still well be floating somewhere.
Laws were changed and chemical waste is now supposed to be incinerated, stored or safely buried in landfill. But have we just shifted the problem from the sea to the land and places people live?
We're driving down Clayton Street in Bellevue. I guess you could say it's a battler suburb. It's a sort of low-income area, cheap housing. There's a bit of Homes West or public housing mixed in here. It's a divided sort of community in the sense that there's a lot of industrial development starting out, mostly sort of cheap industrial lots. And there's a number of residential sections mixed in with it, but largely those residential areas have been encroached upon by the industry and people are tending to sort of get pushed out by that.
With his young family, Lee Bell moved into Bellevue in Perth's outer eastern suburbs in the mid-90s. His new house was across the road from an oil refining company that he found out had been dumping toxic waste there.
What was your health like when you were here? It was poor, and it got considerably worse the longer we stayed here. I had problems with blisters and lesions all around my face and mouth that would come out periodically while I was here, especially when the winds were high and dust got blown over. I couldn't breathe properly through my nose for the whole time I was here. My partner was sick as well.
So Lee, his partner Jane and their neighbours got organised.
We started up the local action group, the Bellevue Action Group, and we got a lot of people on board. And we started lobbying government, we started holding protests, we started taking our message to whoever would listen. And we put pressure on the Port government to get it cleaned up.
And that's exactly what happened. But this newly formed residents group soon stumbled across an even more worrying sight.
The name on the fence alarmed us. That was the first thing. We happened to be driving past one day and saw this sign that said hazardous waste solutions, and we thought, you know, that sounds really unsafe. And then you know, we sat on that for a while and we thought maybe we should go back and just check that out. And that's when we started seeing all the barrels, taking all the photographs.
We were able to identify the sort of quantities of material on site, but we could also identify from some of the labels, where possible, what type of chemicals they were actually storing. We've got barrels stacked 4 high just in the background there, various paints and resins stored in the foreground. There's a number of acid containers dotted around the site there that can be seen.
The Bellevue residents were shocked at the state of waste control, a company set up in their suburb to take some of Western Australia's most hazardous industrial waste. For a decade it had been licensed by the government as a chemical and solvent recycling plant, but its main business in reality was stockpiling toxic waste in thousands of drums, many rusting, leaking and unlabelled. Waste produced by panel beaters, hospitals, large industrial companies was being dumped. Heavy metals, acids, sodium aluminate and perchloroethylene or dry cleaning fluid, a known carcinogen, along with many unknown substances, were all lumped in together. Yet government departments were recommending the site to industry. Brian Blair is the first waste control worker to speak out.
As stuff came in, it was dumped all over the place and not processed appropriately or quickly enough. Yeah, so there's leaky drums everywhere and, yeah, junk all over the place.
Were there spills at all?
Yeah, always spills, always leaky drums and things. Yeah.
Like hazardous chemicals leaking all over the place?
Yeah, anything from a few mils up to 1,000 litres, yeah. I was working pumping an unknown acid. A lot of things were unlabelled, so we were using this acid to neutralise some other chemicals. So I was pumping it through these pipes about 3 to 4 metres up into a tank. And then the aluminium fittings started to get eaten away by the acid and started spraying out everywhere. So I wasn't aware of it, and some other worker called out to me to get out the way, so jumped out the way, flicked the pump off, and yeah, then the pipes just almost fell apart there. So yeah, that was quite dangerous. Don't know what the acid is, still don't know what it is, but managed to eat through the aluminium fittings pretty quickly. Yeah.
But it was not just the site's workers who were concerned. A strong warning came from one of the country's largest industrial companies. It was using the operation to dispose of its toxic waste on the advice of WA government officials. In the mid-90s, they sent chlorinated solvents, acids and heavy metal compounds there for some 10 months. Then the company's industrial chemist, Ray Brown, went and visited the site.
When we actually got there, we were pretty amazed at what we saw in terms of the overall look at the site, the storage of chemicals, the disarray of and chaos that we saw there was pretty amazing, really.
On Ray Brown's advice, the company stopped using waste control immediately and began trucking its waste to the eastern states. Brown then contacted the WA Health Department, who'd advised his company to use waste control in the first place.
I rang this person up and told him, you know, in pretty straightforward terms what we saw and how we'd certainly never intend to use them in the future and wouldn't recommend to anyone that they did, and suggested that he went out and had a look at the site himself, and his reply was that he didn't have time to do that. So it was a fairly disappointing response, to say the least.
The site went downhill from there. The Health Department regulated waste control until the mid-90s, when the Department of Environmental Protection, or DEP, took over. The DEP then shared responsibility with the Department of Minerals and Energy. Residents wanted it shut down, but these government departments allowed waste control to operate year after year, saying it was better than having uncontrolled dumping.
The approach that the department took was to try and bring this place up to scratch. Now, hindsight tells us that that just went on too long and ultimately led to a problem.
It's hard to see how much worse the site at Waste Control could have become to warrant its closure.
Yeah.
Can you give me an example of just how much worse it could have become?
Yeah. Let's say that, for example, it was clear that chemicals on the site were mixing with stormwater and hitting the natural environment. that sort of stuff is something that is obviously very, very serious. You've got demonstrated pollution happening.
That didn't happen? It didn't wash out of the sump into storm water?
No. There's no evidence on the files that we've got in the inspections that were taken that there was pollution of the natural environment from there.
But the DEP has now admitted to Four Corners that in 1999 there was contamination of the natural environment via a storm water drain. It even issued 3 official warnings afterwards to clean up or be shut down. Contamination from the site also caused frantic emails between government departments. The Water and Rivers Commission wrote to the DEP's Manager of Pollution Response and said, "I sense that we are sitting on a time bomb. It's like waiting for disaster to happen. This will not sit well with the community, especially when they are put at risk. It is a volatile situation." But the then Liberal government had other monetary concerns. The Environment Minister told Cabinet, "If waste control is unable to trade out of its difficulties, then it is likely to go into liquidation, leaving government with a stockpile of waste and a contaminated site." Fearing the full clean-up would cost it $1 million, the government instead lent the company $100,000 to remove 1,000 of its drums, half the stockpile. Why did your government bail out waste control to the tune of $100,000 to keep the site open when you knew it was already a contaminated site in a potentially dangerous state?
That's the very reason why immediate action was taken. There was a potential risk of safety to the public.
Would it be fair to say that you bailed out waste control because it was the cheapest option?
It was the cheapest option, however, it was also the best option.
However, by the time I started working there, the area where they'd been removed from had built up again, and eventually we built up with so many drums it was difficult to store any more drums in there. We just had it just completely full up with, drums of chemicals and flammable liquids.
But not only did the Department of Environmental Protection not close down waste control, it actually used the facility. The department sent leftover pesticides and herbicides there that it picked up from farms under what's called the Chem Collect program. What did the DEP send to waste control?
No waste that we generated.
But waste you collected, though?
No, companies sent waste there under our requirements, but the DEP itself doesn't generate waste.
You didn't send any material from the Chem Collect program, for example?
Okay, the Chem Collect is something we do on behalf of the federal government to see that those chemicals go to the right place. Yeah, there may have been Chem Collect waste go there.
So, given that the DEP was sending its Chem Collect material to the site, again, is that a conflict of interest when you have to determine whether it should be shut down or not?
Yeah, it's not the DEP's waste.
You've got to get rid of it somehow, though.
Yeah, well, the DEP runs a service there for the federal government to see those wastes go to the right place. Was there a conflict of interest? Did we want to see them going for our own purposes? Absolutely not. The thing that drove the department and drove government was good waste management. No commercial consideration whatsoever. That's not our core business.
After nearly a decade of known infringements, including toxic spillages and storing highly poisonous and flammable liquids on top of one another, a government department finally took legal action. The Department of Minerals and Energy charged Waste Control with 10 counts of breaching the Dangerous Goods Act. But it was all too late.
I'll never forget the day that I got the phone call at 1 o'clock in the morning, and it was a really hot, still night, and one of our group members had been driving home from dinner that evening and had seen the fire and had stopped not far from our old house and rung us and said, "That chemical factory around the corner is on fire, you're not going to believe this."
Can you check if the houses on Irwin Street have been evacuated, please? Over.
I don't think there's any occupied, but I will follow that up.
I was in the shower and we heard this almighty explosion. Went outside and all you saw was across the road was like getting lit up like a Christmas tree.
Jesus. You felt the heat off of that.
The fire raged all night and Bellevue was partially evacuated.
We're going to have a go at trying to filter out some of the contaminants going down the drain by using our spill kits.
Authorities worked frantically to try and stop poisonous runoff from the fire flooding into the Helena River, a tributary of Perth's Swan River. It also didn't take long for the fire to spread elsewhere, as exploding drums landed around the suburb.
You had situations where a drum would explode and the fire would become volatile and explode, and then it would explode again on top of itself. So you would have fireball actually rising into the sky.
You're getting huge plumes of black, dirty, contaminated, toxic, very toxic smoke.
Smoke plumes heading roughly south.
Are you worried about your exposure to the fumes at the fire?
Not at the time. You don't have time to think about that yet. You're more worried about the whole street is going to go up with fire because there were 44-gallon drums everywhere. I don't think we had time to think about the house at that time.
You just couldn't hazard a guess, literally, into what types of cocktails and combinations you would end up when you've got, you know, so many potential contaminants in the beginning, and then under the conditions of heat and fire, you'd have thousands upon thousands of different chemicals coming out of that fire.
There's a very strong odour of like burnt paint or paint thinners.
It's not known what was burnt, but lethal dioxins were certainly formed. These most toxic of chemicals stay in the body for years and cause cancer.
We're just putting down some pads here.
Huge amounts of dry cleaning fluid also went up. When it's burnt, it can become phosgene, also known as mustard gas. With prevailing winds blowing away from residents, nobody died, but the long-term health effects of the fire remain unknown. Hundreds of firefighters were at the front line of exposure. Most used breathing apparatus, but not everybody.
We were called by pager at about 4:14 in the morning, and we were asked to attend the bridge at Military Road, Bellevue, for what was a mop-up.
When the chemical fire spread to adjacent scrub, volunteer bush firefighters were called in, amongst them the brigade from Stoneville.
When we got there, there was smoke everywhere. We had no idea we were attending anything like a chemical fire, but there was smoke everywhere from all sorts of sources. We were fighting the fire directly downwind of the fire itself. There was a very light easterly blowing, so there wasn't much ventilation of the fire, so we were breathing all these fire byproducts for all the time we were there.
So whatever chemicals were being burnt were being blown directly at you?
Exactly.
If you'd known it was going to be a chemical fire, would you have taken different equipment?
If it was a chemical fire, we wouldn't have attended. It's not our role to attend chemical fires.
So you wouldn't have gone at all?
We would have withdrawn our services. We would, in fact, they should never have called us in the first place. That's the more important thing. Not that should we have gone, it's should they have called us.
With no breathing apparatus, volunteers were vomiting and bleeding from the nose while fighting the fire. Some were hospitalised. Others have reported strange bruising patterns, as well as coughs and headaches that went on for weeks. As WA's senior fire officer, Nick Devine was in charge of fighting the fire from the emergency room at headquarters. Is it an acceptable situation which saw those volunteer firefighters putting out the fire downwind from a toxic plume without proper breathing apparatus? Is that an acceptable situation?
It's not acceptable for firefighters to be working in any sort of environment that's unsafe.
Was that one of those environments?
Well, those firefighters, and I wasn't actually there specifically at that time, but I've been able to ascertain that those firefighters may well have worked in an environment that was potentially dangerous. But there's an incumbence on individual firefighters and crews to ensure that they don't expose themselves as well.
Well, in their case, they say they weren't even told it was a toxic fire.
Well, in their case, to our knowledge, they weren't actually at the toxic fire. They were supposed to
right
be
next to it, putting out a bushfire caused by it.
Well, they were at a bushfire, that's right. And
right next to this toxic fire,
as I've explained, they were responded to a bushfire. For a firefighter, whether he be a career or a volunteer firefighter, to be a member of a fire service and not be exposed to danger is just not possible. That's what we do.
Fire and Emergency Services denies there was a mistake using bushfire fighters next to a chemical fire and has made no changes which would prevent that from happening again. The morning after the fire revealed the extent of its damage. Firefighters walked over the unstable, smouldering mound of drums, risking a fall into a reignited fire or the toxic sludge gathering underneath. With the fire still smouldering, residents' first thoughts turned to property. Local businessman Peter Vla walked around the disaster zone that was once his timber yard and now totally destroyed.
And what did you see when you got here at 7 in the morning?
Finished burning. They just let it burn all night. And they asked me...
Your place had been burnt to the ground by that
time?
Yeah.
Really all they were interested to start my bobcat and push all the embers apart so they could put it, mop up the leftovers and that. So I started on it, but I walked out straight away. The fumes are just, I said, I'm not working in this sort of stuff. I'm gone.
Property can be replaced, but residents breathing in the fumes had more immediate physical concerns.
Initially we had the sore throat and itchy eyes, but that was natural. I mean, you could taste the chemicals in the air, so you had to have some sort of response to that.
They found blood in my urine. Now, the last time I had that problem was when I was pregnant with my son, which is nearly 21 years ago. And all of a sudden, the blood is constantly there.
I'd had a couple of cysts come up, right, which is not unusual. I mean, but I'm relatively fit. I've never had a cyst before in my life.
Oh, I had all these burns on my arm and in my hair because of whatever the shit that was, am I allowed to use that word? Okay, all the stuff that was floating around in there when the 40-gallon drums were exploding. It was burning me, and the next day I started coming up in red lumps, and then it turned into rashes, which was also in my hair and that as well.
We were up and down here most of the morning. We went back, because actually after a couple of hours I was pretty sick already, so we went back.
You're feeling physically sick?
Oh yeah, well, you know, like you want to throw up.
Nauseous?
Headache, nauseous, yeah. And they told us to come in and get one of these wristbands put on because we were exposed to fumes in the area.
How did you put it on?
They put it on. In the fan, they put it on and registered our names and that to be monitored for, chemical poisoning or whatever it says on the back.
This wristband presumably means that somebody in government or in a government department knows that you've been exposed to these toxic fumes. Has anybody contacted you to check on your health?
No, nobody's contacted me at all.
Has the government conducted any health tests on you?
No, definitely not. I haven't been approached basically by anybody.
Has anybody from the health department been here to see you to speak about your health?
No.
No one's visited you at all?
No. They haven't even rung.
You've been asked to come to see me by your lawyer.
Chemical exposure can create long-term illness. Cancers, nervous disorders, respiratory problems. So according to Dr Andrew Harper, a local specialist, the residents he's met have cause for concern.
We've got people, as I've mentioned, who've been exposed. We've got people who've got symptoms. And you and I have met recently a bunch of these residents who live close, and they are voicing their concern about their health. And they're saying that it's now 11 months down the track from the fire. They haven't had any specific information, education or medical care. And there has been no systematic provision of health services for these people consistent with the nature of this event. And this is a sad reflection on our public health system.
We've spoken to a good many residents who say nobody from the health department has asked about their health. Given that you don't have that information, how can you assess the impact of the fire?
We have information on the impact of the fire. But the information that we have is
talking about the people in the highest risk group, though, who live right next to where the fire
Those people
was.
were given the opportunity to go to the general practitioners or to call us, or there was a health direct line that they could have called to report their concerns. They could have called me personally or people in my group that were dealing with the fire at the time, and we would have taken their report seriously and looked at it.
When the health department told residents to ring their GPs if they felt sick, it was just the first in a series of official sidesteps. Nobody wanted to own this fire. Certainly not the man who owned Waste Control. Jeff Claflin has a PhD in chemistry and is treasurer of the country's peak waste industry body. He refused our requests for an interview, blamed arsonists for the fire, and gave us this statement. I am personally driven by a desire to help our community. I have a great deal to offer our country and this state, and have given greatly of myself over the years. I am being singled out as a scapegoat to take responsibility not only for my actions, but also the shortfalls of governments and regulators. The court government didn't accept any blame for the state of Dr Claflin's dump either.
I'm sure that he was attempting to do the right thing in terms of the collection and storage and recycling of waste.
Why are you sure of that?
You're asking me what did I think of him as a person, and I'm sure that he thought that. And as such, he was providing to the community a service that wasn't being provided.
But what makes you so sure that even he thought he was doing the right thing?
In his responses to us and the way that he often responded back to the department, it was obviously his intention to always be doing the right thing, at least in the written form back to the department.
But there was so much evidence that he wasn't doing the right thing, though.
Well, the department constantly monitored it, and that was part of the strict conditions that were put in place in terms of their licence.
A week before the fire, the WA state election saw Labor come to power. Its performance since the fire, overseeing the clean-up, health and environmental testing, and keeping the public informed, has unfortunately looked a lot like its predecessors. Labor left the DEP in charge of the clean-up.
Roofing structures collapsed after the distillation units.
Despite being a regulator of the site, the department didn't know what chemicals were there. They'd asked Dr Claflin, but he's never provided a complete list.
Thick oily residue on top of the water here. It could be related to the heat exchanger that uses oil.
The DEP used subcontractors who also didn't know what they were dealing with.
I was called in as a contractor to go down and watch and block off all the spill. Just walking around the site. When I first got there, I was just walking around the site mainly.
So you walked all around the site?
Yep.
And what sort of protective gear did you have when you were doing that?
First 2 days I had none at all. But then...
no gear at all, nothing to protect you?
No gloves or anything, just my standard work gear.
Massive amounts of contaminated material were buried. Soil, trees, firefighters' clothing, and toxic sludge sealed in cement blocks.
This is the well liners that have been filled with concrete. This is the contaminated soil.
But not everything was removed. The DEP contracted waste company Cleanaway to conduct preliminary tests. In Lot 2 next door, cadmium was found in the soil. Safe levels are 100 parts per million. Cleanaway found levels passing 1,200. Ethyl benzene, toluene and xylene are safe at 30 to 50 parts per million. Levels were found at up to 11,000. This soil was never removed. After initial sampling, Cleanaway recommended in a draft report far more extensive groundwater and soil tests. The DEP rejected this and made sure the recommendation didn't appear in the final report. The draft report also recommended a community health risk assessment. Again, the DEP refused. Meanwhile, Bellevue residents called for a full-scale investigation and they began collecting their own evidence.
Behind me, you can see the drums. The Department of Environmental Protection have been, and Department of Minerals and Energy have been involved in the disposal of the waste. Initially, the community were told the drums were so clean that they were clean as a whistle and could be removed. However, they were later found to be so highly toxic they could not be transported.
A bit of a model also causes some pain.
The government agreed to a parliamentary inquiry. The Labor-controlled committee heard evidence for 4 months, and last December it released the first of its 2 reports. Residents were dismayed.
I think it's very pleasing, and it's very pleasing that every expert that we've been able to consult with, all of the research that we have done, is giving satisfaction to this committee that there is a very low risk of long-term health impact on both the community and the emergency services personnel who are involved in fighting the fire.
The report paints the picture as if it had almost never happened. It's almost as if you could go into that local environment now and they can say that, oh, there was no environmental impact really beyond a few, sort of polluted drains, and there was no health impact.
But it's pretty clear.
The residents group found reason to question the rigour of the inquiry. It relied heavily on the evidence of the Health Department's principal toxicologist, Dr Peter DeMarco. Dr DeMarco used testing conducted by Cleanaway straight after the fire to claim lead contamination was at normal background levels. But when we read the Cleanaway tests, we found evidence of dangerous lead residues in runoff water, including 148 times acceptable levels in a drain at the nearby school. We showed the report to Dr DeMarco to ask how we could have found this to be normal.
You can't tell me then if that is lead at normal background levels.
I'm happy to get back to you on that.
Why can't you look at that now?
Because I like to read the report from beginning to end, not just one table in the report. So it would be irresponsible of me to look at an isolated piece of information on a whole report and comment.
So you haven't read the report? You haven't read that Cleanaway
I don't know
report.
whether I have or I haven't. What I've said to you is that I'm more than happy to look at the report, examine it and get back to you and give you the answers to the questions that you pose.
Dr DeMarco did get back to us, and having read the report, he now admits there was lead contamination in Lot 2 next door and in the school storm water drain. He claims they were both inaccessible and therefore safe. Bellevue Primary School is only 500 metres from waste control. Contaminated water from the fire flooded into its drain from Thursday through Friday morning. Later, Cleanaway tested the drain, finding cadmium, mercury, lead and chromium at very high levels.
There we have the most sensitive group in our population, young children, who, in some cases are 10 times more sensitive than adults to certain toxins, and we're putting them back in an environment where they're potentially exposed to toxic chemicals. It's ridiculous, it's absurd.
My son actually went back to school on Friday, and the drains were obviously still contaminated at that time. They didn't start to pump out the drains until Saturday or Sunday.
In Volume 1, you're dealing with the potential health impacts of this fire. Why didn't you mention the school in the report?
Because there was nobody at the school. Nobody was exposed during the fire.
But they went back to school the next day, didn't they?
No, and then they left a couple of days later.
But so they were at school the next day, and you don't think that's a...
No, they weren't there at the next day because the fire happened on a Thursday night. So the earliest they would have gone there was... I don't think they were... Yes, I beg your pardon, you're right. They were there on Friday morning.
And that doesn't worry you?
Well, yes, it does worry me. Of course it worries me.
In the following days, drains were flushed until tests showed the water safe. The residents group claims there were other errors from the inquiry. Polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs, are amongst the world's most toxic chemicals. The DEP advised the committee, and it accepted, there was no evidence of PCBs at the site. Yet though it can't be proved PCBs were there at the time of the fire, residents have found documentation showing PCBs did pass through waste control.
When you're presented with evidence that starkly contrasts with what the government's saying, you have to jump to the conclusion that somebody is trying to suppress the truth about this site.
We are satisfied on the basis of the very best advice that we can get from both the state's public health experts that the likelihood of long-term, medium to long-term public health impacts is low. We are, as a community and as a government,
It seems that the report from the government seems to be minimising the problem. It's made a general statement which says it's unlikely that there'll be long-term health effects. Now, in general, I think for the total population exposed, I think that it is unlikely that there will be long-term effects. But for the high-risk subgroups, the risk could probably be quite different. And they're the ones for whom something should be done about it.
If people have been exposed to unnecessarily high levels of chemicals, these would have manifested in acute symptoms, which may even require hospitalisation. That did not occur.
Except
there were
symptoms. With firefighters, for example, who were vomiting.
Firefighters, yes, but in terms of the community, and I stress that my responsibility is the protection of public health. In terms of the community, that did not happen.
They have no idea of the actual exposure of the people. So they're saying that those people nearby, who they haven't spoken to, nearby, aren't going to have any long-term health effects. Sorry, how can you come to that assumption when you haven't gone and asked? Were you exposed? How long? What were the symptoms you immediately suffered? Are you still suffering any? And they haven't gone out and done that. So how can you come up with an assumption that there's going to be no long-term effects? They don't even know the short-term effects because they haven't asked the right people yet.
So there's a fair degree of guesswork that's gone into this.
With educated guesswork in terms of what exposures could have occurred.
Professor Jeffrey Spickett was called to the inquiry as an expert independent toxicologist. He recommended that to be certain about public health, everyone exposed to the fire should be examined in a government-organised series of ongoing checkups at regular intervals. The inquiry ignored this, again placing the onus on individuals to register themselves for future reference.
Everybody that indicates that they feel that they might have been exposed or that they feel that they're exhibiting symptoms consistent with being exposed to the toxic waste plume will be asked to place themselves on their register, and their doctor will know that they're on the register.
Do you think that's what Professor Spickett had in mind when he recommended surveillance?
Well, that's as I understand it. If you've got some other information.
No, I didn't mean. I meant some form of systematic approach to assessing the potential impacts of exposures to the air contaminants from the fire.
Organised by the government?
I presume the government would have to organise that, yes, or through the health department.
One of the main issues that we felt was that the government, the DEP and the health department have been providing all of the advice, but in our opinion they've been a little hamstrung by their own liability over their relationship with the site. So we don't see it as being good enough for what the community needs, and we really need some independent expert advice there. So that's the research that we've been doing.
The residents now wait part 2 of the inquiry's report on the role of government departments. They're not hopeful.
There's a lot of jobs on the line. There's a lot of senior administrators in those departments who put people at risk. A lot of people in the public were put at risk. A lot of their own personnel were put at risk. And they don't want to be held accountable. They don't want to be held legally accountable. They don't want to be held financially accountable. And the government of the day is always wary of coming out with a report from an inquiry that may leave the government open to compensation payments. All of this plays heavily on what's happening at this inquiry now.
This is Mandarin Control, radio check, over.
Stoneville's firefighters are equally sceptical. They say the WA Fire Department and their local council demanded firefighters first submit any evidence to them before it went to the parliamentary inquiry. The volunteers prepared an independent submission anyway.
We believe there was a subtle form of intimidation applied to prevent people from speaking up. We're not afraid to stand in a bushfire and deal with danger. We're certainly not afraid of a few bureaucrats. We will do whatever we do. In fact, this fire has perhaps strengthened our resolve to push to get some proper changes in here which recognise the efforts of volunteer firefighters and the support that they need.
Since the fire, the Waste Management Association, Australia's peak waste industry body, has re-elected Waste Control's owner Jeff Claflin as its national treasurer. That's despite his company being in liquidation and having lost his licence to operate. Yet the DEP may still charge Dr Claflin with pollution offences. As for the mess from his toxic waste dump, it's still not been cleaned up. Skips full of shredded barrels remain, open to the elements. Contaminated soil from the main site and Lot 2 has not been removed. Comprehensive groundwater testing has finally been done in and around Waste Control, a year after the fire. Four Corners has seen the yet-to-be-released report, and it contains bad news. It says there's significant soil and groundwater contamination present beneath the site, migrating across 3 of the 4 site boundaries into 2 separate aquifer systems. So that means toxic underground water has entered a regional water table. It's unknown if the contamination has reached the layer below, the huge Leederville aquifer, part of Perth's drinking water system. This toxic water may also be heading for the river system. It'll be interesting to see how much of this report is released to the public. A public around Bellevue that's grown very sceptical of its government.
So if you could have the ear of the government, if you could say it...
That'd be sore. I tell you now, my mouth would get going and I wouldn't be able to stop. Because I've got a lot of things I'd like to say to them. Or else if I could, I'd make them stay in this area for a month. Let them stay in this area and let's just relight that fire up and let's see how they feel. And let's get their little kids here and then whatever else they hold dear to their hearts here in this area and see how they like it.
Since the end of sea dumping, the Australian landmass has had to accommodate toxic waste.
Big oily residue on top of the water here.
Yet no state or federal law entitles people to know exactly what chemical waste is stored and where. Is there another waste control waiting to explode in another Australian suburb? The events at Bellevue suggest that you won't be told.
You can join an online discussion on the toxic waste issue from 9:30 tonight Eastern Daylight Saving Time or from 9:15 p.m. West Australian Time. Just go to abc.net.au/4corners.